following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This episode, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, goals. Longtime listeners know that one of my top 10 phrases is, healthy goals are based on things you can control. But that simple concept can be challenging for some people to learn. So I'm going to give you some motivation to have a healthy relationship with goals instead of developing what I'm colloquially calling achievement addiction. Now, I went back and forth on whether I wanted to drop the catchy achievement addiction term, and I don't literally mean a chemical dependency on achievement, but work with me with the metaphor. It's useful to remind yourself why constantly chasing status-driven achievements is not healthy, either short or long term. And joining me tonight is returning guest Jason Bradshaw, an award-winning science educator from Peel Region. That's a place in Ontario, Canada, for international listeners. Jason will be here to talk about the problems with an education system that emphasizes chasing grades. And I'm going to set up the bigger picture for that conversation. So if anything inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, since I'm being somewhat deliberately provocative this week, go to nottherapyshow.com, fill out the comment field, join the mailing list, please, so you're always up to date on announcements, or you can go to Not Therapy Show on Twitter and Instagram, where I've been posting a lot of videos of my cats lately. Why not? It makes people happy. Okay. Goals. Based on things you can control. Why is this important? Validation. Validation is not about agreeing with someone's position, even your own. It means accepting the position without trying to change it. Now, if this is a foreign concept to you, you've come up in numerous invalidating environments, and that's not your fault, quite the opposite. But remember, top 10 phrase, don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. There are two kinds of validation: internal validation and external validation. External validation is important. Internal validation is necessary. External validation grants us social status. It can give us a lot of benefits. When we're young and don't yet have the tools to self-validate, external validation creates our baseline feeling of self-worth, which is why kids raised to believe they're only as good as their last major achievement are riddled with anxiety and prone to catastrophic thinking. If they aren't constantly achieving, they're going through achievement withdrawal. Again, at first I wondered if the catchy achievement addiction angle was the right way to go here. Again, obviously it's not literal, but thinking about it as withdrawal is useful. External validation is a hit, right? It's a hit of good feelings. It feels great. Our brains are wired to seek it out, at sometimes even crave that release of feel-good brain chemicals. But we can't control when we're going to receive external validation. So being reliant on it, chasing it, leads to low self-worth and people-pleasing behavior. If external validation is your only source for those hits of feeling good, you're gonna bottom out. And this obviously isn't healthy. Now, internal validation is somewhat harder at first, but it's the exact opposite process. Internal validation is the innate sense that you're allowed to have feelings, all feelings, positive and negative. People are like, what? Of course I'm allowed to have feelings, but sit with that. Are you really okay with feeling bad? Do you stop yourself and quote unquote humble when you're feeling good? Humility's great. Not properly celebrating your achievements isn't. You've got to celebrate those good days so that you internalize them and really feel the good as well as the bad. This is the foundation of my top 10 phrase. Perfect is a lie. Stop trying to be perfect. There are too many subjective elements to opinion and perception for perfect to be a real thing. The best we can do is great, even excellent. But perfect isn't just good. It isn't great. It isn't excellent, right? It's a toxic concept because we all make mistakes, and dealing with the mistakes we've made, both internally and externally, that's a learned skill. Now, because of this, internal and external validation are linked. It's easier to give external validation, and you're more likely to receive it when you learn how to self-validate. In part, it's because you don't tolerate people who constantly drag you down. But it's more than that. If you don't have a sense of internal validation, any praise you give somebody else is going to be tainted by envy. And no praise you receive is going to feel real. Internal validation also increases your chances of success because it's what keeps you going when things get hard and what allows you to realize you're throwing good effort after bad sometimes. Internal validation facilitates feeling hope. It gives you a better ability to trust your gut on things. But most importantly, without internal validation, no amount of external validation will ever be enough. You're constantly going to be chasing those short-term ephemeral fixes because internal validation is the very thing that makes you feel like it's enough, like you're enough. Look at the number of very successful people who are clearly miserable. The, famous attention addicts. The world puts these mostly men up on a pedestal. They're lauded as great people, and they still can't stop themselves from behaving in cruel, immature ways. I don't have to name them. I don't want to name them. You know who they are. Just pick your least favorite one. These very, very famous achievement addicts are easy to spot. It's not enough for them to do well. They have to make other people suffer. They have to put people down. Then they have to scream about how well they're doing so everyone knows. They're constantly comparing themselves to other people. Look how good I am. Look how bad they are. And everyone is expected to actively agree with them. Constantly, how well they're doing, how terrible that person they're mad at is doing. No amount of success makes them feel really good because they're achievement addicts. Internal validation isn't about achievements. It's about a feeling of inherent worth. That feeling that you matter as a person. A friend of mine is involved in heraldry, coats of arms, stuff like that, and numismatics. He knows a lot about medals and coins and stuff like that. He said to me recently that he could instantly boost attendance at his charity events by offering attendees a medal. In fact, when he doesn't offer medals, some of these wealthy, accomplished people see no point in attending. He said to me, they've lost the awareness that a medal recognizes the achievement. The medal isn't an achievement in itself. I have a similar attitude regarding people who cheat in multiplayer video games. What? Yeah, people cheat in video games. It's actually a big problem because people treat the higher rank on the leaderboards as the actual achievement, instead of the rank being acknowledgement that you're a good player. Dudes, it's a video game. Cheating at video games is stupid and pathetic, and I'm not normally this harsh, but in this case, wow. Achievement addiction, right? And this sort of achievement addiction is such a widespread problem that Call of Duty, the franchise Call of Duty, recently implemented a feature where cheaters see fake copies of other players. So, it negatively impacts the cheater's gameplay, but the developers can study how these cheaters cheat. Now, when you're cheating at video games, people talk about video game addiction, and I can fight with people on video game addiction, but that need to be someone, that need to rank highly, that's what I'm referring here as a memory device, as a trigger for thoughts, as being addicted to achievements, not the game, the status, the bragging rights. Not the same thing. Because we're in a society obsessed with status. No denying that, right? Our society idolizes the ultra rich, even as a lot of people can't stand them. There's this message that being poor is a character flaw. And because of this, because of all the judgments, we're losing the collective awareness that status isn't the same as achievement, and achievement isn't the same as worth. So if you weren't born into money, okay, even if you were, internal validation is essential to feeling fulfilled and breaking cycles of abuse. So how does building internal validation work? I'm going to get to that after the interview with Jason Bradshaw, Peel Region educator, because I'm sure he'll have comments about this stuff. I know he feels strongly about chasing grades. So stay tuned. We're going to get to Jason after the break. If anything inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, go to nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com. Join our mailing list, fill out the contact form, or check me out on Twitter and Instagram. I've been being better at posting things to Instagram lately. Thank my cats. Yeah, we're gonna pause and come back with Jason Bradshaw. Really looking forward to it on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana. I'm still not a therapist. And it's time on our achievement addiction show to get to the interview. I have a returning guest that, full disclosure, guys, I wanted an excuse to have him back on because I like him so much. I got Jason Bradshaw, award-winning Peel Region High School science teacher, with me. Jason, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so I kind of voluntold Jason to come back on the show because I really like, you've got a lot of good feedback about your previous segments. And Jason sent me an article about rising high school Ontario grades and university admission. And we got into a conversation about chasing grades. And Jason and I are in agreement that we don't like chasing grades, right, Jason? Why don't you like students chasing grades?
Oh, there's a lot of issues with it. And I mean, we talk so much, like in general, about like the mental health crisis that young people are going through. And we're willing to point fingers at so many things, too much screen time, social media, the effects of the pandemic. But before all of this, students have been hyper anxious about marks and their grades and pleasing their parents and getting into university. And I think we overlook that because, we ourselves are a product of that system as well. So we just kind of accept it as normal. Like, I know that I did for a long time, but it's just so damaging in a lot of ways.
That's really funny because I was weird in that I hated tests and I hated being graded, but I really liked learning. And
Hmm.
I remember loving it when my teachers gave me, and I'm going to sound like a huge nerd here. I don't care. I'm a proud nerd. When teachers gave me an assignment that didn't have a mark, I thrived. I loved being able to try things and not being graded on it. And I talked to other educators and they said, I tried that and nobody handed anything in because there was no immediate reward for it. I'm like, why? And every single educator said because they don't see the purpose if they're not getting something out of it. And I had another guest on who talked about teenagers and that part of the brain that is constantly trying to figure out where they fit in the world. And it sounds like you're experiencing this firsthand. You're having to offset kids freaking out because they think that if they don't get 9 out of 10 on every test, they're going to be failures in life. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And it is so disheartening to see how young people are tying their self-worth to the grades they get in school. And it's a message that they're getting from home, they're getting it from society, they're getting it from the media.
Mm-hmm.
And like right now, I'm in the midst of the end of the school year, exams, report cards, all of that stuff. So it's like marks have been like forefront in my mind, just as a necessity of my job. And what really breaks my heart is you wouldn't believe how many emails I get from students who have written their exams and they email me and they say things like, Mr. Bradshaw, like I really loved your course and it was great having you as a teacher, but can you maybe bump up my mark another 5% or another 10%? And I feel bad because I understand why this would be their primary concern, but
Mm-hmm.
it just goes against everything that I try to instill in them throughout the semester. And like every time during the course when they ask me about their marks and they ask me questions like, is this worth marks? Or, how much is this going to be worth in our final grade? I always say to them, you're asking the wrong question. Like you should be
Mm-hmm.
asking, what am I going to learn from this? How is this going to help me improve? How is this going to make me a better science student or a better scientist? But it's just not the same message that they're getting from everywhere else. And when they ask me at the end of the semester, will you raise my mark? Will you bump up my mark? That's thinking that is completely like separate from the learning, right?
Right.
Because what does it mean if I bump up your mark 5%? Does it mean that you magically learned 5% more?
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. It's just like it's oftentimes it's just a matter of vanity and self-worth. It's just an 85 feels better than an 80%.
Yeah. And really that can be one exam that you didn't sleep well before.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that I'm talking about grade 11 math, of course, enough about me. But yeah, that and that's not life. I mean, you know that, I know that. A 16-year-old doesn't know that. They don't have the life experience. All they've learned is good grade good, bad grade bad. And that sounds so obvious, but that's not true because especially in science, you said, how do I be a better scientist? Well, science is all about failing and eliminating possibilities until you succeed. You have to
Yes.
stick it out. My stepdad was a biochemist. And so, they'd run a bunch of labs and most of, a lot of things wouldn't work. And then you get one that did, but you had to eliminate the different things that didn't work before you found the one that did. And if you give up the minute you get a fail state, well, you're never going to complete the really difficult video games that I play. And this is
Hmm.
going somewhere, I swear, because the same person who is terrified of failing in real life will play Bloodborne and Monster Hunter and all those really, really difficult games, and they'll enjoy it. So they're terrified of the fail state, the you have died screen in the real world, but not in the video game because they say the video game is safe. Failing is part of the process. We all get it. Why aren't those lessons transferring to real life. It's completely illogical. So there must be something interrupting that transfer.
Absolutely. I think it's just the messaging that we send. And you're right, it's so artificial because you're right. After school, there's no point in your life where you're like graded on everything you do on this like numeric scale.
Yeah.
It's completely artificial, but it does lead to exactly what you're talking about, this risk aversion. And because I teach science, just like you said, part of the process is
Yeah.
experimentation.
Yeah.
You get it wrong more than you get it right, but I can tell you that so often when I'm asking my students to perform inquiry, to investigate
Mhm.
things, they are afraid to try something that might not give them the results that they want. They don't even want to make a hypothesis about an outcome because they say to me, sir, will I lose marks if my hypothesis is proven wrong? I'm like, no, if
Yeah.
you disprove your hypothesis, you are doing excellent science. That is
Right.
kind of the point. But they just get this message where like grades are just associated with you get it right or you get it wrong. If you get it right, you get marks. If you get it wrong, you lose marks. And those marks are what gets you into university. Those marks are what
Mhm.
gets you a good job. And they just don't have any intrinsic motivation, or they don't understand that the learning is really what gets you the success, right? Ultimately, how many of us remember what grade we got in grade 10 science or grade 9 math? It doesn't matter, right?
See, I
Um,
remember the
mhm.
grade I got in grade 10 science because it's associated with a trauma. Because I got a
Yeah.
98% in grade 10 science. And I came home and heard, where's the other 2 marks?
Hmm.
And that sort of speaks to it. Now, I realize now that was probably adults going, whoa, and feeling a little intimidated and making a joke that I couldn't understand when I was a year ahead. So I was only 14 at the time. And,
Hmm.
but, as a kid, that gutted me because I
Hmm.
thought it was really good until I got a message that it wasn't good enough. And grades
Hmm.
are this deceptive thing. Because, like you said, what's the real difference between an 80 and an 85? It's psychological. When you
Hmm.
get into work, I mean, the Canadian entertainment industry is terrible for rewarding inaction. Various media companies, people keep their jobs by not making a choice. Because if you do nothing, there's no failure. And if you don't fail, you don't get fired. There's no achievement goals. There's no, like they do in some video game companies, well, they'll actually set aside money for experimentation. They'll take 10% or whatever an operating budget just to set up an incubator for people to play around in because they know that one new gameplay mechanic might make them billions. That's the difference in the playing not to lose or playing not to fail and the playing to win mentalities. And this chasing
Hmm.
grades, it sounds like what you're saying is playing into that playing not to lose instead of playing into the next scientific breakthrough that's going to change the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, could you imagine like what kids and young people could come up with if they had an environment where they didn't have to worry about, getting a certain average, if they could just be given this blank slate to learn and experiment and, let's see what you come up with. Let's see what you learn. Let's see what you produce. Let's see what you create. But instead, we have a system that has to try and quantify their learning in a way that's kind of artificial. And it occurs to me now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is we there's so much concern about cheating, about using
Mm.
AI and Chat GPT and all of that stuff. And what people don't acknowledge is the only reason that a student will ever cheat on anything is because getting a high mark is more important than learning from
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you don't learn anything from having an AI write your report. It might get you a better mark. That is it.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have a system where the measuring tool, which is the marks, is then becoming the goal,
Mm-hmm.
that messes up everything. You're not reaching the real goal of learning. You're just trying to find ways to game that system and achieve a higher score.
Yeah, and I mean, that spills out into other aspects of life. People complain about the socialization issues in younger adults, and that's a that's a pivot. So we should go to break before we get into the socialization issues inherent with chasing grades on this episode of It's Not Therapy, talking about achievement addiction, just as a way of thinking about it, not literal addiction. I am Liana. I'm still not a therapist. I'm still talking to Jason Bradshaw, award-winning Peel science educator. We'll be back in a few. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and I'm still talking to Jason Bradshaw, award-winning Peel Region science educator. And before the break, we started to pivot into the social impacts of grades chasing and this achievement driven, what is your mark versus what did you learn? To me, it comes directly out of every other student in your class, in your city, in your province is your competitor in terms of university acceptance. So it's not just about doing well, it's doing better than everybody else. And that creates terrible people who sort of act like narcissists, even though they're not narcissists, because that's the way they've been taught to succeed. Have you seen some of that competitiveness?
Absolutely, yes. And, to go back to what we started with today, that's where the grade inflation is coming from with universities. Because the more of that competitive attitude you get, the more people demand, and by people, I mean the students and their families, their parents, they demand results. They demand those marks in the 90s, 95 plus.
Yes.
And the more that happens, then the universities have to up their bar too, right? It's so interesting. It's just like economic inflation, right? The marks get devalued just like a form of currency. So it just keeps on going up and up and up and compounding the problem. And then that's how you get students who are willing to do anything just to achieve that 95, 98%. And what's really amazing, and by amazing, I mean awful, is we're now reaching a point where it blows back on the teachers and the school systems. And it's not how do I help my child improve, or hey, look at that, they're doing a lot of good things. Thank you for helping them achieve this. It's why did you only give them a 90% instead of a 95? And it's funny how much of it now becomes a teacher having to justify why a student only got a certain mark, and getting this guilt trip on, like, oh, I'm not going to get accepted to this program. It's going to ruin my life. I literally have students saying to me, it will ruin my life if you don't boost my mark by 5%.
Yeah.
And that's what my parents are telling me, and that's what my parents want. And it is just so damaging to them.
Well, it is damaging because, doing corporate consulting, that's not actually what the corporations are saying. Right now, the companies are going, we want people who can learn new skills. And they're doing all these measuring tests to measure potential, which, don't get me started on that. That way lies madness. But the ability to learn and learn from your mistakes cannot develop if people don't make any mistakes. And people are getting through university never experiencing real failure. And so the first time they're stress sick even before it happens, but the first time they get a real setback, it's catastrophic because they never learned in a safe environment. They never learned to get up off the mat. And interesting, I used a sports metaphor because that's part of where I learned. I learned through dance. I learned through basketball. I learned through track. Track was where I was never the fastest runner, but they said the point is you participate. The point is you're part of the team. You learn to show up and not win every time. And I'm like, all right, that makes sense to me. But that was a system that allowed that. And even that's out the window now because parents are fighting about whether a kid is a transgender or cisgender girl when they're 9. I mean, it's the parents and the systems doing it to these kids. So what do we do? Do you have any suggestions? I mean, we can't change the system overnight, but what can parents do?
Well, it all comes back to we need to de-emphasize this very capitalistic way of quantifying success and learning. And it's interesting that you've talked about how learning to fail is an important part of development,
Mhm.
because oftentimes when I talk to people about de emphasizing marks or maybe even eliminating them altogether, the first criticism that they come up with is, oh, you just want to make it so that nobody fails. And,
Really?
if we just, yeah, and if we go to a more a system of descriptive feedback. That's just a way to justify passing everybody. And that's the wrong way of looking at it. For one thing, failing, like you say, is part of the learning process, right?
Right.
It should not be considered this horrible, horrible thing if you need to attempt something again, if it takes you a little longer to master something. And if we can move away from this very quantitative way of marking everything and trying to put a percent on everything, instead what replaces that is feedback and describing to students and their parents, this is what you've done well, this is what you need to work on, and this is what's going to take you to the next step. And that is so much more personal and empowering and useful than saying, oh, here's a piece of paper with a 78 written on it. Like, what does that mean? What does that tell you about your child's learning and about where they go next? Right? But ultimately, it's just the quickest and easiest way to categorize kids, right? To say this is an A plus kid, they go this way. This is a B kid, they go this way. So we really need to, I think, look at ways to just de-emphasize this quantitative, artificial way of measuring everything, where marks become like a currency that kids try to negotiate and their parents try to negotiate.
And my mind is blown right now because descriptive feedback is what you get at work. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
especially with the stuff that I do, some people are just not going to get it. And you get a lot of I like it, I don't like it, and you have to learn to go, okay, why didn't you like it? What didn't you like it? Like, please give me data. I keep quoting Sherlock Holmes and saying, I cannot make bricks without clay. Please give me detail. And the cool jobs that a lot of kids want, I immediately think of video game design because that's something I'm a part of. Doing things again and again and again is a requirement. And it is something, it's like you feel like you're destroying a young person's dream when they first show up, the first time you say, okay, now iterate. And of course, iterate is a fancy word that means do it again. And you will do the same thing again 4 to 12 times on average making video games. And it is so hard for kids who chase grades because okay, you did exactly what I asked you to do, but it didn't work. It's not matching the rest of the game. So you have to do it again. And they feel that that's so unfair instead of part of the process. And I say to the person who's just melting down over it, I said, but are you given time to do it again? And they said, yeah. And I said, then what's the problem? It's part of your job. Well, it's all that wasted work. And I realized that's touching on the thorny subject of merit, right? Do we want to get into that? Do
Mm-hmm.
we want to rip that band-aid off?
Well, that's a tricky one, a tricky point, because you're right. There's this subjectiveness and this
Yeah.
subjectivity in that once you get into qualitative assessment. But I feel like there's some kind of a middle ground between the
Mm-hmm.
two that we have to try to reach, because obviously we can see the harm of just being quantitative and just looking
Mm-hmm.
at numbers. And I'm really intrigued by what you said about the repeating the process in game design,
Mm-hmm.
because so much of the system that we have now when it comes to marks and grading, it's all like based on this idea of getting it right,
Mm-hmm.
just on the first go, right? Like the
Yeah.
first time you take a class, you've got to get your 90% or your 95%, because heaven forbid that, you're not successful and you
Mm-hmm.
need to try again. And I think that most good teachers try to fix that within their classroom, because it's considered best practice to allow lots of opportunity to have what we call formative assessments and to
Mm-hmm.
practice skills before you do the summative assessment, which is when it really counts. But ultimately, you still have that summative assessment where
Mm-hmm.
you need to attach a number to it and say that you achieved this percentage. And kids are always going to get fixated on that. As soon as you tie percentages to it, they
Mm-hmm.
start chasing that number instead of chasing an outcome or achieving an understanding.
Yeah, that's what I refer to as the Tom Holland glitch. Tom Holland, the guy who plays Spider-Man. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
how anybody can dislike Tom Holland. He is objectively adorable and cool and amazing. But there are people out there who can't stand Tom Holland. And no matter how many good things he does, no matter how much money he makes for Sony, no how many great scenes he does, people are just going to hate Tom Holland. And Tom Holland can't do anything about that. And that is life. So if Spider-Man has to face that, don't feel so bad when somebody thinks you didn't do a good job. And people snicker the way you did. And they go, oh, okay. You know, because that is it. When I mean, I've seen the stuff you take on social media, and you are objectively a great teacher on any meritocratic measure. You're a great teacher. But people just dismiss you and say you're terrible at your job. And these are the same people insisting that everything should be merit, quantitative, as if we can measure a great English student versus a great chemistry student, right? How do you cope? What are your personal strategies for processing that?
Oh, that's a tough question.
You just sort of used to it.
I think at some point, and obviously for young people, this is extremely difficult, if not
Mm-hmm.
impossible. But at some point, you develop a sense of your own self-worth, where you learn to understand that there are people out there who are never going to really know you or what you do or what
Mm-hmm.
you contribute. And why on earth should you let their judgment matter to you more than your own? Like, you live with yourself 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
You know what you do, you know what you're worth.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully you're surrounded with people who also see what you're worth and what you do. So I know it is difficult sometimes. I mean, like, you get those bouts of imposter syndrome and self-doubt,
Mm-hmm.
but like, I just have to say to myself sometimes, like, you know what, like, I'm very lucky to be surrounded with people who I know are amazing. And if they think that I'm doing a good job and I'm doing things well, then they must be onto something, right? So
Right.
it really takes away, like, it just takes one good person, I think, who can really kind of uplift you, and that can like counter like 100 random people who know nothing about you but want to make judgments about you anyway.
You saying imposter syndrome just made me realize that Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is about juxtaposing Miles Morales getting into a major tech school and then all the fantastic multiverse stuff that happens. That's a metaphor for imposter syndrome. So that is clearly a message for our time. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but
Oh, I
everybody's seen
have,
across,
and
oh my God, everybody sees Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. It is so good. But yeah,
yes.
and that goes back to, I mean, what you just said, the strategy is going back to measuring yourself by something other than, immediate fleeting success. There has to be, I matter because I am a person at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tough thing to instill in a world that says you're only as good as your last test.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you have any quick things for people who are listening to, like, yeah, what do I do about it now? This is pretty much describing me. Obviously, you've struggled with this yourself. How did you transition from student to teacher? Because that's a weird one too. I remember doing that. And I mean, I know I reward. I reward team members that admit they made a mistake and fix it. But I also present projects where I say, okay, guys, we're going to try this. And I have no idea whether it's going to work or not. If we find out this is a complete disaster, that's a win. Is that it? Just leaders have to create environments where failure is a feature, not a bug?
Yeah, environment is such a big part of it. And I think that's another way in which I've been very fortunate in my life, in that as a teacher, I've gotten to work in schools and with colleagues who are very supportive. And um, not everyone is that fortunate,
Yeah.
I'm afraid. So what do you do if you're in a situation where maybe you don't have that level of support? I don't know what the easy answer is, but I think ultimately it's something you have to look for inside of yourself. Like, you have to come to recognize what it is that you contribute, because you contribute something. No matter who you are or what you are doing, you are contributing something. There's nobody who wakes up every day and, I don't know, goes about doing their best in the world and like can't deliver something if they want to. And learning to recognize that without somebody telling you and assigning a grade to it, once you can do that, I think that is so empowering, and it really will uplift you, because you can take the pride in what it is that you do without somebody else having to say, "Good job, you get a 90%."
Yeah. Jason Bradshaw, award-winning Peel Region High School science teacher and super cool guy, and one of my favorite people on Twitter. Jason, thanks so much for allowing me to talk about Spider-Man a lot, and also thanks so much for advocating for your students. I mean, you're a real asset to the entire education system.
Thank you so much.
Any parting words you want to leave us with? Cool superhero tagline or otherwise?
I just want to repeat what you said about seeing Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. That movie's good. I mean, it feels like we're giving it a free plug, but
I don't care. It's so
is
good.
Sony going to send us money? Like, do we get something for this?
No, we get the warm glow of someone else seeing Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. It's so good.
Exactly. We don't need quantitative benefit. That's
no,
right.
It's all qualitative. It's all the warm fuzzies. It's so good.
Yep.
All right, we're gonna go to our last break after this ad for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Totally free. Anyway, we'll be back with final thoughts, some tips for how you can separate from external achievement on It's Not Therapy. Hang on a few minutes. We'll be back. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on our final segment on this episode of It's Not Therapy, talking achievement addiction. And since this is the final segment, I'm going to teach you how to kick the proverbial habit, or at least get you started. And it comes down to that internal validation thing, and Jason teed us off beautifully at the end of the last segment when he said, recognizing that you contribute something just by being you, whether that's helping out a friend, whether that's being useful, something. You do contribute something. It's a question of finding it. But on top of that, it's about recognizing that there's certain basics that you do actually deserve because you're human, right? All humans. That's what we talk about. Human rights. Human rights are not just for some humans. Humans can set boundaries. Humans can say no. You don't just have to put up with things that hurt you. Now, some of you may be listening to this and going, that's just not true. I tried to set boundaries. I said no. People hurt me, they wouldn't stop. There are people who don't believe in giving people the bare minimum. And one of the toughest lessons I had to learn in trauma therapy is those people have to go somehow. Now, maybe not right away, and maybe not physically, but they can go bye-bye in your mind. Be like Jedi, don't form attachments, right? Just check out from that person mentally and emotionally. That Setting that limit, that saying no, that controlling how much something hurts is the purpose of boundaries. And yes, people don't have to like your boundaries, but they do have to respect them. Top 10 phrase. The people that don't respect your boundaries, my trauma therapist said over and over and over again, those people had to go. I kicked and screamed and resisted. That was the hardest thing for me to do. I finally did it. And what happened was that getting rid of, I will say, they were bad people. Getting rid of the bad people meant I found my people, or began the process of finding my people. And like I said, I did this kicking and screaming. It's hard to reject people when you've been rejected, when you've been raised with that lack of sense of self-worth, not learning how to validate because you didn't get the example of validation from the adults that were supposed to take care of you, your peers, and, it feels like everybody else. If you were picked on, if you were ostracized, especially when you were young, you think it's good to give people all those extra chances because you didn't get them. And that's noble. But think about it, okay? Keeping bad people around isn't fair to the good people around you. And those good people, they have boundaries. And they will eventually drift away because they can't take the bad people surrounding you. You get thrown off with the mess. And what that means is that being a good person, at the end of the day, being a good person that good people flock to, so you get that external validation, so that you can build up your internal validation. Being that type of person requires having boundaries. And a lot of people are wincing right now and immediately going into rejection mode because boundaries are hard at first. Just if you've been a listener to the show and we've built up some trust for a while, just try it, please. Just set small boundaries, even in your own head. Things like, just because this person says it doesn't mean it's true. Just, I don't have to take being called that name. And if the person won't stop, even though I say I don't like it, that is on them, not me. Because those good people, the people with boundaries, recognize that even if somebody may at that moment deserve to get called a name, you can be better than that. And you don't do that because they're a human. And that's it. That's my time. NotTherapyShow.com. Check it out. Send me a comment. Send me a question. Join our mailing list or Not Therapy Show on Twitter and Instagram. Check out pictures of my cats and the videos I make. Until next week, you're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Take care.